我们今天早晨第二个报告是那个科卡教授，那他今天跟我们分享的题目是这个历史神学和华人教会在这个教会历史性的这个意义，历史性的角色。
Okay.
Go ahead.
Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity for being with you.
非常感谢今天有这个机会跟大家一起来交通这些方面的内容。
I have very much been privileged to teach Chinese students at Lincoln Christian University.
那我所在的大学是林肯大学那边，我很高兴能够有很多的机会教中国的学生。
And I dearly love my friendship with Jin Zhu and my good friend Hui Li.
那我也很高兴能够跟祝健牧师李辉弟兄是朋友。
I loved our time of singing and worship that began this morning.
今天早晨我们在一起敬拜，我很高兴。
Even though many of you sang in Chinese, I was able to sing the songs in English.
虽然很多人是用英文在敬拜，我是在用很多人用中文在敬拜，我是在用英文敬拜。
Because they are songs that are common to both the East and the West.
那这些歌我们又有英文又有中文。
But I also thought there could be something even better.
那我也想说，或许有一个更好的。
Because the songs we sang actually originated in the West and were translated into Chinese.
那我们今天早上唱的歌，作者都是从西方的，后来翻译成中文。
What about if the Chinese church originated good, biblically solid songs in Chinese music?
那我想象说，如果是华人教会，如果能够作歌作曲来敬拜神。
Instead of simply translating Western songs into Chinese, why don't these songs come out of the Chinese church?
所以我们不光是唱一些从西方翻译过来的中文歌曲，能够唱一些华人自己创作的歌曲。
Because the state of world Christianity is no longer Western.
那我知道说，现在如果看全球的基督教，已经不再是西方的基督教了。
The globe has shifted from the west to the east.
我们看到从西往东有一个大的转移。
And it is time for the Chinese church to step up and take its leadership.
那我觉得也是对华人教会来说是一个很好的机会，能够站起来，能够在很多的地方成为一个带领的角色。
Congressman Redmond reminded us of some of the things that inhibit that.
那刚才那个 Redmond 议员跟我们分享了有一些方面能够在阻止我们往这个方向发展。
And I want to propose a way to bring the Chinese church up to speed.
那我现在下面想分享的是对华人教会的一个鼓励，也是一个帮助，希望他们能够在这些方面能够成长。
No longer is it simply good enough to translate the West.
所以华人教会不再是常常只是在翻译西方的内容，
but to lead the Christian movement in a serious study of the Bible and tradition.
那特别是在这个历史神学方面，我希望华人教会能够更多的成为一个带领的角色。
As you can tell by my title, we are going to focus on a unique moment in history that can only be recognized by understanding history.
那我觉得我们现在是处在一个非常独特的历史时代。那我们要明白我们这个的角色的话，我们首先也要理解历史。
In order for the Chinese church to take its rightful place at the table and leadership in the Christian community,
那如果让华人教会能够在基督教的整个的历史发展中有它独特的角色，
we need to understand our place in the history of Christianity.
那我们需要明白从历史的洪流来看，我们是在哪里。
This is what we call historical theology.
那这个就是我们平常简单的说，它成为历史神学。
Many of you know that there are many branches of theology.
很多人知道说我们有很多不同的神学。
We do biblical theology, which studies the Bible from Genesis to Revelation.
比方说圣经神学，我们从圣经中创世纪到启示录，我们明白理解圣经。
And we follow the story of the biblical text.
那我们用这个圣经的经文不断的来理解神。
My particular discipline is systematic theology.
那我自己的专业是系统神学，
which looks at Christian belief through topics.
那是通过这些论题的方式来理解基督教。
What is the doctrine of God? What is the doctrine of sin? What is the doctrine of Christ? And so on.
关于神论、基督论，关于人原罪问题等等。
Another form of theology is philosophical theology.
第三类的神学是我们讲到是哲学性神学。
And that is where, as Bill Redmond pointed out, Paul addresses the Athenians in Acts 17.
就像在刚才讲员提到，在《使徒行传》第17章，保罗在跟当时的哲学家们辩论一样。
All the world's philosophies ask the basic same questions.
全世界的哲学都几乎在问非常类似的问题。
And philosophical theology addresses those questions, only gives a Christian response.
那从我们哲学性神学是问同样的问题，但是从基督教的角度来回答。
And then, of course, there is apologetics, which is concerned about giving a defense for Christian belief.
我们还有所谓的护教学，就是来捍卫基督教的真理。
And then there is historical theology.
第5个我们提到就是历史神学。
Historical theology, to give it a definition, is a study of how the church has interpreted divine revelation throughout its history.
那历史神学最主要的工作是一个学科来理解教会作为整体是怎么样理解神在历史里面是怎么样发展。
And our history, of course, doesn't simply begin in the 20th century, but the first.
那我们知道基督教的历史是从第1世纪开始。
Two things I want to point out about historical theology.
那2个方面我想强调。
One insight from what people call church history.
那我们常常听到教会历史这个词。
Church history is concerned about the life of the church.
那这个词强调的比较多的是我们讲到教会的整个的发展。
Major events, people, and occurrences.
主要的历史事件、人物等等。
Historical theology, used in a very technical way, looks at the thought of the church.
那历史神学比较强调的是在教会历史中我们的思想。
Actually, I don't believe that they should be separated.
但我相信这2个方面不能分开。
And for the sake of this presentation, I'm going to group them together under historical theology.
那今天我跟大家分享的，我把这2个合在一起，统称为历史神学。
So we are concerned about key events.
我们一方面关心发生的历史事件。
But we want to know what kind of Christian thinking emerged from these events.
那同时我们也希望说什么样的思想从这些的经历中我们能够
That now bring us to a moment that is a key time for the Chinese Christians.
那当我们明白这些之后，我相信对华人教会是会有帮助的。
Let me suggest that as we study historical theology, we have several lenses that we can look at history with.
那我们研究历史神学有几个很重要的方面，或者是一个透视镜，我们需要注意。
We want to see how did our ancestors interpret the Bible.
那我们希望知道我们以前的先贤圣徒们他们是怎么理解圣经的。
Sometimes we see it done very well and sometimes very poorly.
那有些时候我们看到他们对圣经的解释，让我们觉得很好；有些时候我们觉得有问题。
And like it or not, these influence us today.
不管怎么样，这对我们现在还是有影响。
As Bill Redmond talked about, we want to see how the church has, what its attitude has been towards philosophy and worldview.
那另一方面，我们也知道说，我们也想知道，在教会整个历史过程中，他们是对哲学、对世界观是怎么看的。
Sometimes it is anti the philosophies of the
那
day,
有些时候，在教会的历史潮流里面，是对哲学是反感的。
and on the other hand, sometimes it incorporates these
有
philosophies.
些时候把它们吸收进来。
Again, let me remind you about Acts 17.
那我再次想提醒大家，《使徒行传》17章。
Paul addresses Stoic and Epicurean philosophy.
保罗在那个时候跟当代的哲学家们在一起的研讨。
And uses many of their terms, including quoting their own poets.
甚至用了他们当时时代的哲学家和诗人所说的话。
But clearly the gospel of Jesus is different and distinct.
但是我们知道说，基督耶稣的福音对当时的哲学来说是相当的不一样的。
Another key part of historical theology is examining how Christians look at tradition.
第三个方面，我想强调的，就在历史神学里面，是我们如何看待传统。
Many of us who come from a Protestant background have had a very low view of church tradition.
那特别在清教徒背景出来的基督徒对于历史不太看重。
But nonetheless, we have traditions ourselves.
但不管怎么样，我们还是有传统
的。And church tradition can be a very good thing.
所以教会传统也可能是个很好的事。
In helping us how Christians have understood the Christian faith and what kind of Christian versions are not biblical.
它帮助我们来明白历世历代的基督徒是怎么样看待教会的。比方说
，When I study historical theology, I want to look at how people have viewed the church.
那当我在做历史神学的研究的时候，我很感兴趣的就是历世历代的圣徒们他们是怎么看待教会的。
Is the church a dynamic community that proclaims the gospel, or is it a political system?
那教会到底是一个是宣传福音的一个非常有活力的机构，还是一个政治机构？
And I see both in the history of the Christian church.
当我去看教会历史的时候，我两个方面都看到了。
One of the other angles that this enables us to study is how the Great Commission unfolds.
第五个方面，我们历史神学里面关心的就是这个大使命是怎么样被展开的。
Jesus said, "You will be my witnesses from Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, to the ends of the earth."
耶稣曾经预言说，他说你们要成为我的见证，是从耶路撒冷、犹大全地、撒玛利亚直到地极。
And the emergence of the Asian church today is a demonstration that Jesus' words can be trusted.
那今天我们华人教会之所以能够有这样的发展，也是大使命的一个的成果。
Historical theology enables us to look at the cultural impact of the
第六方
gospel.
面，历史神学关心的就是文化的影响。
Does Christianity change a culture, or does it simply become like it?
那比方说，基督教是改变文化呢，还是与文化合流？
And historical theology helps us to recognize specific historic times.
所以历史神学里面让我们去研究这些关键的历史性的时刻。
We can understand why the church did certain things, even though we might object to it.
那以至于让我们能够明白当时的人为什么做了一些他们当时的决定，虽然我们不见得同意他们。
Many Protestants do not like the idea of monks in monasteries.
比方说清教徒对这种修道院、修道士这种方式就不太喜欢。
They say that is, Christians withdrawing from the world.
他们说这是基督徒离世的一种观念做法。
But as we study the history of the church, monasteries were actually needed for the health and spiritual life of the church.
但是当我们仔细研究当时的那段历史的时候，就发觉说，这些修道院和修道士的出现，对当时整个教会的健康其实是很有益处的。
And actually contributed to the Great Commission when the church was not going out.
而且甚至帮助了在一个时期，当时大使命教会没有在实行大使命，他们却成了一个实行大使命的一个方法。
So historical theology helps us read our brothers and sisters more charitably.
那当我们有一个历史神学的这个角度去看这些事情的时候，我们就不见得去轻易的去论断这些历史上发生的人和事。
And historical theology also helps us to understand the task and role of the theologian.
那第八点，我想强调的就是研究历史神学也帮助我们来明白神学家们的工作和责任是什么。
Is the theologian simply an academic, or is the theologian a pastor?
那我们比方说，我们问说，神学家们他是应当是一个只是一个在学院里面教书的人呢，还是说他也应当也是个牧师？
Or is the theologian both?
那或者是神学家们应当是两个角色都有？
So historical theology gives us several lenses to read the history of the church.
所以我们总结说，这个历史神学它给我们好多的角度来看教会历史。
One specific lens is to look at the role of the church and its relationship to culture.
那其中一个，我举一个例子，是讲到说非常重要的角度，就是看基督教和文化之间的关系。
A classic and maybe a little bit dated book is the work of Richard Niebuhr, Christ and Culture.
他这边有一本书叫做《基督与文化》。
What is helpful about this book, though, is he sketches out 5 ways historically the church is related to the culture that it's been placed.
那这本书里面总结了在过去这很长的时间有5种教会跟文化之间的一些的关系。
The first way is that Christianity has nothing to do with the culture that is
第一
a,
种观念是是反文化。
and Chinese Christians have often been told that there is nothing of your Chinese background that should be a part of the gospel.
那我也注意到在华人的基督徒里面，有些时候被教导说，我们华人的文化跟这个基督关系不大。
You become a Christian, you remove yourself from your culture.
那你一旦成为基督徒之后，你应该从你自己的文化里面出来。
And a lot of emerging churches around the world do this.
那很多现在我们看到很多这个教会的新兴教会的成立兴起，他们往往都是这种观点。
On the other hand, there are Christians who believe that Christ and their culture are one and the same.
那另外第二种观点是讲到这个基督教应该是赞同所有的文化。
And everything in one's culture can have a Christian interpretation.
那任何一个文化里面，我们都可以找到基督教的一个的理解。
And this ends up with a Christianity that is a combination of the gospel and paganism.
那以至于我们就产生一个新的基督教，是把福音和当地的这些文化把它混合起来。
There is the third option where Christ is seen as above culture.
第三个选择是看到说基督教是超越文化。
Bill talked about this a bit this morning.
刚才Bill 弟兄有稍微提一些这方面。
Where there is nature and grace.
然后比方说在古时代，我们认为说我们有自然界然后有灵界。
And there is a spiritual world and a physical world
自然界和灵界之间分开，
that are deeply tied and connected.
但同时也是连接的。
And what is seen in the earthly realm is a reflection of the heavenly.
那我们在自然界所看到的是灵界的一个的反应。
In other words, what we see in this world is more of God's creation than the fall.
那他这可能更多的是在强调我们生活自然界的好的方面，而不是强调了罪的方面。
Again, there is probably some strength to all of these things.
所以这么听起来，前面3个听起来你好像觉得有些地方听起来好像也对，有些地方但听起来好像不对。
And also some great weaknesses. Finally, fourthly, we have the model of the church and its culture in what we might call paradox.
第4种是基督教和文化之间有一种的张力和挣扎。
Martin Luther said we live in 2 kingdoms.
马丁路德讲说我们生活在2个王国。
The kingdom of Christ and the kingdom of this world.
神的国度和属世界的国度。
Now, is that, faithful to the words of Jesus, we might ask.
他这么说是不是符合圣经的教导呢？
But many of us live like that too.
那很多我们也就在这样的挣扎中生活。
And then the 5th model that Niebuhr identifies is Christ as the transformer of culture.
第5个模式讲到说基督教要来更新和改变文化。
This view looks at all truth as God's truth.
那我们看到说，所有的真理都是神的真理。
And Christ does not come to destroy all cultures,
那基督来不是要毁灭所有的文化，
but to redeem them.
却来赎回、救赎所有的文化。
To take the goodness that has been created by God and bring it to fruition.
把所有的美和善在文化当中能够更张扬发扬出来。
So historical theology can help us out in seeing what model or models of culture and the gospel that we are living.
所以历史神学其中一个的功用，就是让我们来明白基督教文化之间的关系。
Okay.
That's pointer.
There we go. And historical theology can help us understand that Christians have done their theology from a number of different directions.
当你去研究历史神学，你就发觉说，整个历史神学的发展我们有4大方面。
In fact, these 4 areas play a part in all of our theologies.
那我们就发觉这4个方面一直在影响我们神学的建立。
Now, we all would like to say our theology is grounded in the Bible.
几乎所有的神学都希望说，我们的神学是以圣经为基础的。
But we all are part of a tradition as well.
但同时不要忘记，我们也都是跟一个传统是接上的。
And theology uses human reason.
那我们知道说，神学也需要我们有理性的思考。
Some theologies more than others, obviously.
当然，有一些神学更注重这种理性的思考，比别的神学。
And then theology is based on human experience.
那我们也知道神学的建立也是受人经历的影响。
I have pictured here the great leader and founder of Methodism, John Wesley.
那我在这边这个图画是约翰卫斯理。
Wesley called Wesley called attention to these 4 items.
那约翰卫斯理他提出了这4个方面对于神学建立的重要性。
And rank them in importance to us as Christians.
他就把它按照重要性从1排到4。
I think we would all agree that our theology should start with the Bible.
所以我想我们可能都同意说，我们的神学首先是以圣经为开始和基础。
But church tradition helps us understand how the Bible should be read or not read.
那第二个教会的历史帮助我们来理解我们怎么来理解圣经。
Christianity is also a faith that has a strong base in human reason.
那基督教的信心里面是有很注重理性的理解的。
And obviously, Christianity is not simply to be talked about, but experienced or lived.
那我们的信仰也不是只是一种理性的信仰，而是一种活出来去经历的信仰。
Now, here's the challenge for the Chinese church as well as all evangelical churches today.
所以现在我们面临的挑战不仅是华人教会，可能任何福音性的教派神学都要面临的挑战。
Be careful of letting experience rise to the top of this structure.
那我们常常听到说，不要让经历变成最重要的，别的都往下放。
Experience is important, but there is an order.
但是我们相信经历是非常重要的，但是仍然是要有秩序。
Let's move on then to, let's see.
Does it go?
There we go. Let me call attention to some reasons to study historical theology given by the noted scholar Mark Noll.
那这边这边照片是一个很有名的一个学者，他叫 Mark Noll， 他曾经写过一些书和文章，讲的说为什么要研究教会历史。
The history of the church reminds us that Christianity is a historical religion.
我们去研究教会历史的时候，我们要非常清楚的看到这是实实在在发生的事情，是有历史性的、真实性的。
Christianity is about what God has done in space-time history.
所以基督教非常强调是神在我们人能够理解的时空里面，他做了事情。
Secondly, historical theology provides a way of understanding how Scripture has been interpreted.
那第二个研究历史教会历史对我们很有帮助的是，我们如何来更好的理解圣经。
Thirdly, it provides a laboratory for understanding how Christians have interacted with their culture.
它第三个方面，它提供给我们一个机会，一个实验室一样的来实践性的来检验基督教跟文化之间的关系。
Almost every issue we face today has been faced before.
其实我们今天所面临的几乎每一个的挑战，在过去都有类似的挑战。
The particular way it is cast may be different.
那我们知道有些细节可能不一样，体现可能不一样。
But the essential issue is the same.
但是本质上是相通的。
And I want you to hear this. If the time has come for the Chinese church,
所以我想强调说，如果机会，华人教会成长的机会，如果就在现在的话，
we cannot afford to make the mistakes of the past.
那我们就希望我们不要再重复以前所走过的弯路和错误。
But we can also learn from the successes of the past.
同时，我们也能够从过去的成功里面得到学习。
We do learn that believers often have acted wisely in situations. That's good news.
那我们看到教会历史里面也有这样的时候当时的基督徒们所行出来的是有智慧的，而且是正确的。
And we certainly learn that even when believers mess it up, the Lord is able to work out His purposes.
那同样的，我们也知道说，虽然我们都是罪人，而且基督徒也会犯很多的错误，有偏差，但神仍然是信实的，仍然是帮助他的子民们往前走。
To put it very bluntly, the Lord doesn't need the Chinese church.
那我如果非常不客气地讲说，神并不是需要华人的教会
Nor the American church, nor the Greek church, and so on.
同样的，也不是说需要有美国的教会或者是希腊的教会等等。
The church history shows us that the Lord will accomplish His tasks when people are obedient or disobedient.
那我们教会的历史非常清楚地显明人顺从和不顺从，神的心意都没有被拦阻过。
And finally, studying the history of the church keeps us from becoming arrogant.
那我们研究教会历史，第四个对我们很有帮助的是，让我们要学习谦卑。
Sometimes we look at previous believers and think we're so much smarter and spiritual.
那有些时候我们看到过去的一些的人，觉得说我们比他们聪明多了，而且成熟多了。
Historical theology reminds us we have not arrived.
那历史神学研究让我们看到说，我们还有许许多多需要成长更新的地方。
And I can imagine in 50 years from now, believers will say, how could those in 2015 be so stupid?
那我相信说，50年之后，当他们来看我们所想的、说的一些、做的一些事情，他们会觉得我们是很愚蠢的。
But there will be a generation that will ask the same question of them.
那或许在他们之后，又有新的一代会说，或许他们也还没有搞懂。
So, let's see.
Okay.
There. How come you have the magic thumb?
I'm just pointing randomly.
One last thing, and this is from a colleague of mine, Bob Ray, who has published a recent book from InterVarsity.
那我另外下一点我想强调的，这个是我的一个同事叫 Bob Ray， 他曾经写过一本书，也是说为什么教会历史这么重要。
He offers 3 reasons to study the history of the church.
他提出3个理由，为什么我们需要学习教会历史。
Number 1, a study of the church's history gives us an understanding of orthodoxy.
那我们研究教会历史，学习教会历史，帮助我们明白正统教义是如何形成的。
From the very beginning, Christian believers have looked to the past to understand what truth is.
那我们从一开始，基督徒们就往看到过去来明白真理到底在哪里，真理到底是什么。
The Chinese church is capable of bringing some new insights into Christianity.
我相信华人教会是能够带进一些新的看见，在教会的真理上。
But I would question whether we bring new doctrine.
但我们要非常的小心，说我们是有新的教义出来。
Secondly, Bob races we study the tradition for our identity.
第二个原因，我们研究教会历史对我们很有帮助的是明白我们自己的身份和角色。
We are part of a much bigger heritage than Chinese.
那我们虽然是华人背景，但是要明白我们的整个的属灵遗传是远远超过华人。
Our heritage goes back to Pentecost.
那我们整个基督教的传统是回到五旬节，使徒行传里面记载五旬节的历史。
And our history includes Jews and Gentiles and Latin and German and English as well as Chinese believers.
那我们整个大家庭包括外邦人、犹太人、希腊人、德国人等等等等。
And as we see our family in this large way, we become the church that Jesus has called us to be.
当我们有这样的眼光和胸怀来看到神的大家庭的时候，我们才明白，才更多的明白教会是什么。
Not a church that is the prisoner of any one ethnic group or culture.
那么不要完全的被限制在一个自己的种族和文化当中。
And finally, he says, as we study the tradition of the church, we learn how to do ministry.
第三个方面，当我们认真的去研究教会历史，我们就发觉我们应当怎么样来做教会事工，过基督徒生活。
Many of our brothers and sisters in the past show us how to be good pastors.
那我们去研究教会历史，就看到说如何能够更好的做牧师来牧养。
And we also learn some examples of how not to do
同时，我
the
们也
work of
明
the Lord.
白哪一些错误不要去犯。
Okay.
No?
I don't get it. One last reason, and then I want to just hone down a little bit, why I am passionate about the Chinese church learning historical theology.
那我想最后仍然强调，为什么华人教会需要来研究教会历史？
I want the Chinese church to seize the time that God has given her to be leaders.
那我有一个很强烈的感动，就是希望华人教会能够抓住神所赐给我们的这个机会。
To instead of simply put Western Christianity in Chinese terms, put Christianity in biblical terms.
我们不要把西方的这个基督教的历史把它当成全部的基督教，而应该说看从真理的角度入手，怎么样来看说西方和东方同时在认识神、认识基督教上来有贡献。
But we can't do it unless we know from where we came.
那我再强调，我们要想做好这个工作，我们必须理解教会历史。
And then this enables us to come to the table.
所以，只有我们好好的来明白历史、研究历史，然后明白神在我们身上的心意，我们才能够在我们的末世的时代明白我们在做什么。